Danielle, I'm not seeing any attendees yet. Is the webinar started?
I would have to stop sharing in order to be able to see that.
It started now. There's attendees coming in.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. It's so good to have you with us tonight. My name is Catherine Arden, class of 11 with Middlebury College. And I want to let you know that we'll start the webinar with Amor Towles at 7 p.m. While we wait for more guests to join, please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourself to the other attendees and say where you're joining us from. Please be sure you select all panelists and all attendees when you write your message so we can all see it. And if I know you or if we know you, please give a shout out because otherwise it's hard to see everyone. So again, welcome. We're so glad you're here. 15 minutes, can't wait. Hey everyone, my name is Catherine Arden, class of 11. We'll be started in about 7 minutes. You're in the right place. It's so good to see everyone on the chat. Just keep introducing yourself. Really enjoying seeing the comments and the compliments. I'm sure Amor is thrilled. So yeah, you're totally in the right place. Give it another 5 to 6 minutes and we're ready to get started. So thank you. Just keep the comments coming, guys. Hey there, everyone. This is Catherine Arden again, class of 11. We'll be getting started in about 5 minutes. You're totally in the right place. If you are just joining us, you can feel free to introduce yourself, use the chat function. Make sure you put it to all attendees and panelists so we can see your comment. Thank you so much for coming. We'll be going in about 5 minutes. Hey everyone, welcome. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this exciting edition of MiddReads Book Club. We are so excited you are here. We're gonna probably give it 2 minutes before we give it the official start, just let everybody kind of get settled in. But welcome. We're so pleased you're here and so excited to welcome Amor Towles and get started in just a minute or two.
All right.
Wow, people are still rolling in. This is so exciting, you guys. Like everyone's getting together to discuss a book that's this wonderful novel, and this is great. In this time of like COVID, we've all been kind of at home, and book events aren't happening the same way. To see so many folks getting together, it's making me so happy right now. Keep it coming. How's it? Hi, Professor Katz.
How are you?
I'm doing great. It's been a while since Dostoevsky in translation.
Yep. I recognize some of my former students on the list.
Oh, how exciting! We can ask questions about that midterm.
Hello, Catherine Hayes.
I'm enjoying seeing all the Russian majors. It's a Middlebury College Russian majors reunion. Making me very happy. Well, shall I get this party started? I think probably so. So officially, hi everyone. My name is Catherine Arden. I am Middlebury College class of 11, and I am so delighted to welcome the members of the MiddReads Book Club and all of our guests to this exciting evening, a conversation with author Amor Towles about A Gentleman in Moscow, one of my favorite books of the last 10 years. I am a Middlebury College graduate, a Russian major, as I've already said. I'm also the author of The Bear and the Nightingale, a New York Times bestseller set in medieval Russia. So I'm very excited to be meeting Amor for this talk at the other end of history. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to go over. Professor Katz and I will begin a conversation with Amor and then move to a Q&A session where we will take your questions. You are either accessing this webinar right now through Zoom or a YouTube live stream. If you are on the Zoom webinar, your camera and microphone will remain off, and we're going to turn off the chat in a minute, but you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will monitor the questions and present as many as we can to Amor after our conversation. Now, I'm so pleased and so proud to introduce my co-moderator, Professor Michael Katz. Michael graduated from Williams College, where he was the very first Russian major. Following graduation, he studied at Oxford University and the University of Leningrad, after which he received his PhD in Russian literature from Oxford. Michael became Dean of Language Schools and Schools Abroad at Middlebury in 1998. After his term as dean ended in 2004, he taught full-time in the Middlebury College Russian Department, Dostoevsky in translation, and retired from full-time teaching in December 2010. Professor Katz, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm sure the members of the MiddReads Book Club are excited to get the program started. It is now my pleasure to introduce our special guest this evening, the author Amor Towles. Born and raised in the Boston area, Amor graduated from Yale and received his MA in English from Stanford. Having worked as an investment professional for over 20 years, he now devotes himself full-time to writing in Manhattan, where he lives with his wife and his 2 children. Mr. Towles' first novel, Rules of Civility, which was published in 2011, was a New York Times bestseller and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of 2011. The book has been translated into over 20 languages, its French translation receiving the 2011 Prix Fitzgerald. Mr. Towles' second novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, which was published in 2016, was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year in hardcover, and was named one of the best books of 2016 by the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR, and probably the Middlebury campus. The book has been translated into over 35 languages, including Russian. In the summer of 2017, the novel was optioned by E1 and the British director Tom Harper to be made into a 16-hour miniseries starring Kenneth Branagh. I wonder who he's playing. Welcome, Amor.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Catherine, both of you. And thanks to everybody who's joining us from the Middlebury community.
We are so excited to have you and so excited to be doing this. I will just get this party started. Question for you. An image, an idea, a story, a phrase, so many things can spark a novel. In your case, what was the spark for A Gentleman in Moscow, and how did the spark begin to grow?
Okay. I began writing fiction as a kid. I should start by saying that. I wrote fiction in elementary school and high school, in college and graduate school. But when I finished graduate school, I moved to New York City and I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm. And 20 years later, I was still working side by side with him. And while I was working at the firm, I would spend a good deal of time on the road. And so in any given year, I'd spend a week in Los Angeles, a week in Chicago, a week in London. And one year when I was arriving at my hotel in Geneva for the 8th year in a row, as I walked into the hotel, I recognized some of the people hanging out in the lobby from the year before. It was as if they had never left the building. And I thought to myself, this is a nice hotel, but can you imagine who actually had to live in it? And in the elevator on the way upstairs, I was like, actually, that's kind of an interesting idea for a book. A guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. So in my hotel room, I took out the hotel stationery and I quickly began sketching an outline for what became A Gentleman in Moscow. And right off the bat, I knew that I wanted to tell the story of an aristocrat under house arrest in Moscow at the Metropolitan Hotel. So those sort of aspects of the story came to me really within the first 10 minutes. And on the basis of kind of over the course of that weekend, I outlined a lot of the key components of the book. But I then spent a couple of years outlining it in detail and then spent some years writing it and revising it.
Definitely. So it sounds like, follow-up question, it sounds like the idea was first for being stuck in a hotel, and then you asked yourself, where would you be in a hotel stuck? And your answer was 20th century Moscow.
Exactly. That's basically what happened.
Interesting, because you would think, you wanted to write a Russian book. You thought, what Russian book shall I write? Hotel in Moscow. But no, you want to write a hotel book.
Yes, that's right.
Amazing.
Yeah. Kind of the way it works. And that really comes about because I said to myself immediately, if I'm going to tell a story about someone who's trapped in a hotel for 30 years, he shouldn't be there by preference. He should be there by force. Definitely. And that's kind of what clicked me into Russia. Now, I make light of it now, but I am not an author who picks a topic, researches it, and then writes a book. Mm-hmm. What I do is I pick topics that I'm already deeply interested in. And so my first novel, Rules of Civility, is set in New York in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And I didn't do any research to write that book because I had been a fan of the 20s and 30s since I was a kid. I'd seen the movies, read the novels, listened to the music, studied the art movements. And so I used that kind of long-term fandom as the foundation for inventing my version of New York in 1938. And then when I was done with the first draft, I went back and began to do some applied research to sort of sharpen some details and fix some errors and things like that. And it was sort of the same thing with A Gentleman in Moscow. I don't think I would have leapt to, great, I'm going to tell a story about a Russian aristocrat, in the Soviet era. That would not have been my instinct if I didn't already have a long-standing love of Russian culture, which I had kind of taken over the course of decades. And I should say, for all the people who are joining us from the Middlebury community, I am the least educated in the history, language, and culture of Russia in this panel. So you should know that right now. Both Catherine and Michael have, a deep connection to the country of their own. And so, but yes, my connection to the country was really through, I didn't go to MiddReads. I didn't take Michael's class, but it basically was as if it was through something like Michael's class that brought me into Russian culture. Like so many Americans, my interest in Russia began with my love of the 19th century Russian novel.
Okay.
I'm interested in Eloise in Moscow and wonder if
Yes, right.
Eloise was your inspiration, and was that your first experience of Moscow and your first experience of the Metropole Hotel?
Yeah. All right. So I'll take those quickly. I certainly know, I know and love the Eloise series.
Mhm.
And in a way, probably the Park Plaza book is the most closely aligned with The Gentleman in Moscow, because that's the one where she does not leave the building. Whereas I think in Paris and Moscow, she gets out of the hotel and gets to wander around. But certainly, the spirit of Eloise is probably somewhere in there as part of my long. I loved it as a kid. I think probably one of my favorite things of that book is that, for those of you who know it, is that she's living in the Park Plaza, and there's a point where it's sort of, what does she do during the day? And the page folds up vertically, because to do a drawing of all the different floors in the hotel that she visits in the course of the day. And I think I love that as a boy, kind of turning to that page and sort of following all of her foot tracks, and then relive that when I read it to my children. But for me, I don't speak Russian. I don't have Russian heritage. The first time I went to Russia was in 1998. And I went with my high school English teacher, literature teacher, who with whom was the first person that I read Russian literature. We read Crime and Punishment, and many, many years later, we were still friendly. We were having a drink, as we kind of do every year, and he said, "I'm going to Russia this summer," and I said, "Great, I want to come." And he said, "Great." So we went to Moscow together in 1998 for the first time, both of us.
Did you stay in the Metropole?
We had I think we had a drink at the Metropole. So I'd never spent the night there, but I knew what it looked like, where it was, and those were the key elements. That's why right away I knew I wanted to set the story there. And for those of you who don't know, the Metropole is a real hotel. It was opened in 1905, and it was the first really great grand hotel in Russia. And when I use that term, I use it very specifically. The grand hotels were a generation of hotels. They kind of opened between 1890 and 1910 all around the world. And they all had very similar attributes. The size of a city block, a big palm court to serve tea in, multiple restaurants, an American bar, shops on the ground floor, very high-end services, international cuisine. This is what the grand hotels were, whether you went in Vienna or Paris or on the Mediterranean or to the Waldorf in New York City. They all kind of share these components. So I knew that while the Metropole had a very central role in Russian history, it was also kind of a internationally cosmopolitan space. And that would kind of make it a kind of a nice sort of odd oasis within the story set in Soviet times. But yes, and I guess the one thing I have to tell you about that, the other thing is that when I decided to write the book, and I did the outlining, I actually began to write the book. I decided, okay, I'm going to go since I'd never spent the night in the Metropole, I'm going to spend a week, in the hotel once the first draft is finished. And that's what I did. I spent a year and a half writing the first draft, and then I carried my manuscript to Russia and stayed in the hotel for a week and began revising. And so, that kind of raised the question, why wait till the end of the first draft to go? And that's, Catherine may see this differently. Different authors have their different kind of instincts about what works for them. For me, I want to have a chance to imagine as much of the story based on what I already know as possible before I start getting reality, to interfere with the way that I think the story should be realized, with the way it should be told, what it should sound like, look like, what should happen. I want to realize all those things in my imagination as fully as possible before I really start getting into the sort of the more annoying details of reality itself. So then, yes, I went to the hotel spent the night in the hotel after I had written the draft.
Oh, it's definitely a truism that learned spaces and things that you've been taught can interfere with imagined spaces. And I think when writing, you want to make sure your imagined space is strong before you start like bringing in your other things. So the hotel was your first character, really.
Yeah, that's right.
So your second character was probably the Count,
Yes.
I imagine. So why did you want an aristocrat? And what was the foundation of the Count's personality? Like what made him the way he is in your writing?
Why the Count? There's sort of there's the instinct right at the beginning. Oh, he's going to be a count. That's going to be great. Yeah, and he'll get in trouble, and they'll put him in house arrest. And the Soviet era, it's perfect. And he'll be kind of this sort of backward-looking figure. Sort of a bon vivant with a 19th century style. Kind of that's right off the bat. I kind of had that instinct. I think it was only when I'd finished, or maybe I was 2/3 of the way through the book, that I could have articulated what I'm about to say to you now, which is that I think one of the reasons I chose the Count, one of the reasons he was such a compelling character for me in this sort of setup, is because, rightly or wrongly, I sort of had this notion of one of the things that makes Russian history interesting for me in the early part of the 20th century is that in 1900, Russia was way behind the West. It was behind America and England and Austria and Italy in terms of industrialization, in terms of sort of the modern era had begun, and Russia was not participating in it at the end of the 19th century. And so you had extremely high illiteracy and a high, the peasant population was over 85% of the population, I think, and illiteracy was over 90% in the nation, and very little industrialization. And still, if you look at the pictures, everybody looked in Russia in the royal court like people looked in France 70 years before, 100 years before,
Right.
Elaborate uniforms and mustaches, the whole thing. And so you have that. So it's kind of this backward. I mean, I guess I don't mean it in the most pejorative sense, but literally backward-looking nation at the time of the revolution, or at the time of the First World War. What happens with the revolution is when the new leadership comes in. And of course, all kinds of bad things occurred under the Soviet era. Terrible crimes against humanity, literally, and great price was paid by the Russian people to go through the Soviet era. Okay, but at the opening of right after the revolution, one of the things I think is fascinating is that the new government was extremely forward-looking. And many of the things that they immediately said we're going to adopt ended up becoming the defining factors of 20th century in the West. Things like secularization. Enough of the church. Churches had too much control over our lives. It's going to be a secular society today. And that's really what happened over the course of the 20th century in the West. Women had equal rights. Were guaranteed immediately by the Communist era. We're going to encourage education on a massive scale. So we're going to overcome the 95% illiteracy by requiring that all Russian citizens, regardless of age, above a certain age, know how to read within a set period of years. And then, of course, we're going to industrialize, and like at a super fast pace. That's what, of course, the 5-year plans were. So you had this kind of this crazy moment in Western history, which is that Russia, in the scope of like Western Europe and the United States, was totally 19th century at the beginning of the First World War. And as soon as the revolution was over, it was barreling ahead into the 20th century at full speed. So it's a long way of saying that the Count, to me, I think, again, I didn't understand this when I started the book, but he's kind of a 19th century figure with a 19th century sensibility. And he is standing on kind of the gap between the two centuries in a country where you went from one to the other with the flick of a switch. And so, that became kind of an interesting sort of, I think, backdrop to then tell a story.
I feel like you touch on this with the Count, but also his friend Misha, who is a man who you mentioned is born out of his time originally, and then finds his little moment in the early 20s, right? When it's sort of post-revolution, but pre-Stalin, and he finds his voice just so briefly, and then history snags him again.
Yes.
So is that kind of where you were going? Is one of the things you were pursuing in this book is the placement of a man in history, of a person in history, and how history can be right for a person or wrong for a person, or I'm not sure what I'm saying actually, but I feel like it's fascinating, whatever I'm not saying.
Yeah. No, I think yes, in the case of Mishka, it's a very specific, a terrible paradox that the revolutionary moment was the moment that suddenly he is a man in his time. And that lasts for like a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things, as Russia changes course and the idealism that he feels and that he kind of represents broadly in the book. That sort of that early generation of truly idealistic intellectuals who, even though they had some of the advantages of the previous Russian life, were eager to make these changes, because of course many of the revolutionary figures did come from the educated classes and from in some cases the moneyed classes. And so he's that figure who, this was his moment, and yes, it comes very fast, and it turns against him quite quickly too.
Thought that was fascinating. Professor Katz, I could just keep rambling, but please.
No, I have another question.
Yes.
I'm interested in the fact that the novel was translated into Russian. So my questions are, was that done in this country or in Russia? And two, do you have any sense of what the response was in Russia to your novel?
The first of all, on the translation front, for the most part in the world of fiction, the books are translated on the ground in the country where they're going to end up, because strangely, this surprises many people who don't know the publishing industry very well. When you write a book, even if it's going to be in 30 languages, each country basically publishes that separately. So even though, for instance, today Penguin, where I'm published by Viking at Penguin, is a huge international conglomerate, they only will buy the rights to publish that book in America. And then they don't have any control over who's going to buy it in England, or who's going to, even in England where it's in English, but never mind Germany or Russia. Yep. So other Penguin divisions may buy it or may not, and it may end up in the hands of a totally different company. So it's always done very locally. And the local publisher is the one who then seeks out the translator who they think is best suited to the material, hires them, oversees the translation, and then brings the book to fruition in the native country. I am proud of the fact that the book ended up being published in, I think, almost every Soviet bloc country, all throughout Eastern Europe and all the Eastern European languages, which is great. The feedback, it's hard to get. You don't get as much feedback. From what feedback I've gotten has been has been largely positive. Now, I knew that when I wrote the book, that the toughest audience for that book, of course, is the Russian people, because they have every right to look at that book and say, first of all, Towles has got no business writing a story set in Russia, never mind one that's in the Stalinist period, which we know either, to some degree firsthand, but certainly through our parents and our grandparents and the stories that came down, and our families may have paid particular prices, or, and we may have an ideological or political viewpoint on this. So you're bringing a lot of very valid emotional and specific knowledge to that book. So I knew that in writing that, and almost the closer you got to Russia, the more risk that you had that the book would be thrown at the wall by the reader. And for the most part, though, I think that the response from throughout the Soviet bloc has been relatively positive. There's enough acknowledgement in the book that there's an element of fantasy to the book. It's not being presented as a social realism, and I don't even mean that in the Russian sense. I mean in the Zola sense. It's not setting out to really tell you exactly what happened day by day to the Russian people. And there is a magical quality to it, which is a part of the story, and they recognize that. I think the book does simultaneously sort of talk about this magical world that Count is in, but also sweeps in the more dangerous aspects of life outside. But I think what I found that most people in Eastern Europe would have appreciated about the book is that it's a more balanced portrayal as an American telling a story. It's a more balanced portrayal of Russian life than what most American depictions of Russian life have been over the last 50 years, whether that's in film or books. Because of course, I grew up in the Cold War era. Michael grew up in the Cold War era. Catherine, you did not as much. We're all envious of your youth. But yes, those of us who grew up in the Cold War era, Russia was always presented as a place where it was breadlines, fear of arrest, risk of imprisonment, social and artistic repression. And of course, all of those things were aspects of Soviet life at different times for different people in different waves. But what the American representation of Russian people did not present was that, of course, throughout the 20th century, Russians fell in love. They had families. They had great love of music. They had great love of the theater. And they had hope. They had humor. These things are there too. And so I think that ended up being, for the Eastern European readers of General Moscow, the pleasant surprise in the book was that while it does try to acknowledge some of the most difficult aspects of life during that era, at the same time, it's also making it clear that people are struggling to live lives to their fullest.
Have you done any meet and greets in Moscow?
I have not. I have not been. Well, that's not true. I've been back to, for instance, the Metropolitan Hotel, who are big fans of the book, as you might imagine. So it's not really. I've been interviewed there, and stuff like that. But I've never done a presentation to the Russian community more broadly. But what the one funny thing, and this kind of goes back to the decisions about what you imagine and what you research. The last time I was at the hotel, and the manager, who's a wonderful guy, came out to greet me and said, I said, hey, how's it going? He said, oh, it's great. We love the book. And he said, oh, except for that thing. And I'm like, what? What, Dominique? What thing? What's wrong? And he said, well, yeah. As those of you who read it know, right at the beginning of the book, the Count is marched out of his fancy suite on the 3rd floor and taken to the attic on the 6th floor and given kind of a beat up, dusty, small room to then live for 30 years. And so Dominique, the manager of the hotel, says, well, everybody comes, they're very excited, they want to see the hotel, but the first thing they ask is, can we go to the 6th floor? But the Metropolitan Hotel has no 6th floor. And so I love that. Now, I knew that the Metropolitan Hotel didn't have a 6th floor, but I love the fact that the novel largely, or a large portion of the book, takes place in a sort of an imagined space sitting on the top of the roof of the actual building. Although, as they say, it drives the hotel manager crazy, but that's fine.
It made me think of A Little Princess, which is probably not the most obvious one, but it's a kid's book that I loved long ago, where the heroine is a rich girl whose father dies, and she's impoverished, and she's taken from her beautiful room in her school and marched upstairs to this attic to be a servant girl.
Oh, okay.
So
I've not read that. I should read it.
One of my favorite books, and it gave me delightful, like, I'm back in this place of hope and not fantasy, but possibility, I think is a better word. So I really enjoyed that part. I have a sort of a related question. Did you know which sort of pieces of history you wanted to work through or map out as you were outlining, or did you just start with the hotel itself and then kind of build your characters and through them find the history? Was it history first, or characters first, I guess, is kind of my question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that I'll start by saying that in both Russian literature and American literature, there is a great tradition of minimalism. And Chekhov being a grand example in the short story of Russian literature, someone like Raymond Carver in America, or Hemingway, of course, really bringing incredible amounts of story and vividness and emotional content through the most spare type of storytelling. And when I started writing Gentleman in Moscow, or designing it, really, I knew it was not going to be a minimalist book. It was going to be a maximalist book, which means it was going to have everything. It was going to have literature and painting and music and food and and history and philosophy. It was all these things were going to be in there, and to some degree in the consistent with from my the tradition of, say, of a Tolstoyan storytelling. And so I knew all these things would be there. So in the design phase, you're kind of dwelling on 1,000 different things that could play a role in the story. And some of those are philosophical ideas, some of those are works of literature, and some of those, as you say, are moments of history. And I think as I worked through the material, a lot of the time I kind of landing was on, I thought were sort of moments in Soviet history or Russian history where there's a sort of almost a surprise element to it. You know, that the Western reader would be surprised that, oh, that happened, you know, and oh, that's the way it played, that, you know, that's the way that plays out, where because there's something about it that where it might have a resonance with had a big impact on the Russian people, yet as a surprising little thing, and so that you're sort of looking for those little moments that can have that kind of resonance. Some of which are factual in the book, and some of which are made up. Right. So,
Right, of course.
I think maybe it's too obvious, but in certainly I wanted to have from the historical context, the concept of Stalin's famous speech where he says, everything is good now. I can't remember the phrase, but where literally, he says after, very tough government behavior on the people, he announces in a speech that things are better now. And this was an immediate signal to the government apparatus that, oh, wait, okay, we're changing course here. We're gonna take a little bit of our foot off the brake, and we're gonna, people are gonna be allowed to have a little bit more liberty, a little bit more joy, a little bit more fun in their life. And all kinds of things occurred in the aftermath of that. It was basically like 2 or 3 sentences in essence. That signaled this big change and had real impact on the lives of the citizens. So you're like, well, that's an incredible thing, incredible moment of history. I think another one is the, Stalin's decision to stay in the city of Moscow during the Second World War. Where and they kind of march into the subways and bring chairs down to the subways, which is true, that happened. So they could, because they didn't have bomb shelters. They had failed to build them, never thinking that they would need them. So you have kind of these moments like that, which I think are of interest and that I wanted to kind of weave in because of the more general ramifications. But something like the wine bottles, the labels being removed from the wine bottles and the wine cellar of the Metropolitan, that's a made up.
I mean, it did I think speak, the wine bottles, I love that episode. And I think it did speak to the moment, right, in history when people were trying to erase distinctions between classes and between people, even though distinctions have a good side and a bad side. Which is
Thank you.
I'm interested in Russian literature, and one of the things you have mentioned Dostoevsky, and I'm wondering if he was the major influence among the 19th century writers, or there were others who influenced you.
Who, me?
Yes.
I certainly, the whole part of the thing that fascinates me about the 19th century Russian literary output is that it is one of those rare moments where there's this incredible cultural and artistic activity that you basically get a century's worth of art in 20 years, or 15 years. And you see that in the Renaissance in Florence, all of a sudden, it's the art is leaping. One guy is leaping over the other, in this sort of semi-competitive, semi-collaborative, reinvention of what this art form can be. And like in 10 years in Florence, they solve a lifetime of problems, or a century of problems, and change the course of the art. Jazz in America, particularly see in the 40s and 50s, where in New York City, Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and Coltrane are all meeting at one point, playing with each other and listening to each other and trying to revise each other and compliment each other and and you get this explosion, and you could basically take the decade of 1950s jazz and you could spend your life listening to just that. And so to me, that's what happened in Russia, with Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but also, Gogol, and eventually, Chekhov, but Turgenev, and, the whole group were doing this incredible work, and were clearly affecting each other and influencing each other and spurring each other on. And so I really do read that fraternity, broadly, but probably War and Peace is one of my 3 favorite novels, just as an artistic achievement, along with 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez and Moby Dick, by Melville. I think those 3 novels are the greatest achievements in terms of just the artistic integrity and inventiveness of what they achieve, and the emotional impact they have, the breadth of them. But Dostoevsky I'm a big Dostoevsky fan, and obviously so people have been arguing it ever since he and Tolstoy were writing. But they bring such so they are almost simultaneously working, almost in the grand scheme of things, simultaneously writing and bringing very different aspects of the way we think and the way we feel to the surface through their writing. And so, I do think of like, for me, Mishka, who we were talking about earlier, is kind of the more Dostoevskian character for me in the course of that novel, who is struggling with sort of the demons of his own hopes, his own desires, his own place in time, going back to that idea of, if I think that's a very Dostoevskian notion, to be a man who's just out of his time, and how painful that could be, to live that way day after day. But yes, I'm a great fan of Dostoevsky's work generally.
Are we going to start taking questions, Catherine, from the audience?
We have 33 questions, so we definitely should probably get started on the questions. Amor, thank you so much for talking to us. That was amazing.
Yeah,
and I think
my pleasure.
Enjoying keeping going in the questions. 1 second. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to pull up these 34 questions. The MiddReads book club has been reading this book since it was August, I believe. So I think everyone should be primed with some fantastic questions. Let's see. We've kind of covered some of these.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead. If you have
Kathy Snyder asks what you're working on now.
Sure. As a general practice, as I kind of described earlier, I will design a book for a couple of years before I start writing chapter 1. I'm an outliner. I want to know every chapter, what happens in those chapters, the key events. I want to understand the settings. I want to know the personalities and backgrounds of the characters. To some degree, I might even know what they're going to be talking about from one chapter to the next. I kind of sketch all that out over a period of more than a year before I write chapter 1. And then it'll take me, maybe a year and a half to write the first draft of a book, and then about a year and a half to revise, some version of that. I'll go from beginning to end a couple of times, reading through and changing the book. And so I am on the verge of handing in the first polished, I've been through a round of revision, my first sort of polished version of my new book, which is about 3 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy who are on their way from Nebraska to New York City in 1954. And the whole story only takes about 10 days. So, I think that when I finished John Moscow, I didn't really think about this at the beginning, but I have more ideas for books that I'm going to have a chance to write in my lifetime, partly because I've been writing since I was a kid, but I've only been writing full-time as someone in my, late middle age. So I've accumulated things that I want to write. And when I finished Rules of Civility, and I was like, what am I going to do next? And I was like, I'm going to do that Russian thing. I'm going to do that, the hotel story. I think in retrospect, the reason that was so compelling to me at the moment is because, for those of you who read Rules of Civility, it's the opposite of that book in so many different ways. Rules of Civility is 1 year in the life of a young woman, a 25-year-old woman of a working class background who's about to climb the social and professional ladders of Manhattan, learning how to do that. And that's kind of what that book is. And A Gentleman in Moscow, one is a female central, the other is a male, one is a young woman, one is an older guy getting older, but I think the biggest difference being that one is 1 year in the life and the other is 30 years. Because as a novelist, that presents a very different challenge. And for the reader, it provides a very different experience, because that 30 years allows you to see not only how the individual evolves in a changing time, but also how their relationships evolve, how the two different people evolve, and the relationship evolves through that chemistry. But it's hard to do that in the course of a year in someone's life. And so that was great fun to make that shift. And so suddenly to be writing about 3 18-year-old boys in a story that takes place over 10 days, it's once again a good shift of the gears for me, because it requires all kinds of different storytelling skills and styles to bring that to fruition, just as Gentleman Moscow was so different from Rules of Civility. But as I say, I hand that in, the first draft in December. The way that I tend to work is I don't share with anybody until I'm done with that draft. And then I give it to my editor and about 4 or 5 other people on the same day. And I'll collect feedback over the course of 30 days from that group. And then I'll begin the process of planning kind of what my revision is going to be and how it's, you know, what I'm going to tackle in terms of changes. And hopefully that book will then be available to readers in the fall of next year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Here's a question from Alan Barker. Why does each chapter title begin with an A?
Yeah, so it is true that for those of you who didn't notice, every chapter title is only A words. So even if the title is 6 words, it's all the words begin with the letter A. And you know, why is that true? Early in the drafting of the book, like maybe the 3rd, the 4th chapter, I kind of had done it 2 or 3 times. And so I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I like all those A words. And then you're kind of, you have this moment as a writer, it's sort of like, should I do it? Should I just keep doing that? Should the whole book be A words? You know, and you kind of ask yourself, you're like, am I crazy? Is that a terrible idea? You know, and then, but you got to go with your instinct. I'm like, no, I think that's what I'm going to do. It's what it's going to be. Now, I think in retrospect, the reason that appealed to me is partly what I was talking about earlier in terms of, I feel like it was a signal to the reader that this is not going to be the Gulag Archipelago. You know, that this book is going to have some play associated with it. There's going to be some gamesmanship here, some alongside some magic, and so the A word title to me is sort of in that zone, as it were. And I think that all novels are different, and one of the things you're trying to do, I think, as a novelist, in light ways, is to signal to the reader what kind of book they've just picked up. Because you know, what a reader should ask of a novelist is that the novel is true to itself. You know, given its story and its themes and its tone, that it fulfills it's true to all those components without losing its way or getting messy or dragging in components which are not supposed to be there. But for the reader to kind of be able to measure that, to know where they are, that you also have to kind of give signals pretty early to the reader about this is the universe you have just entered. You know, Catherine's done fantasy work where that clearly is part of the challenge, right? Is how quickly can we give this reader a sense of the world that they just entered, so that they can begin to be comfortable there and know what to expect, and then to begin to measure in a way, does this book live up to itself? You know, so yeah, I think the A titles was a version of that. Whereas like the footnotes play a very different version. You know, they're kind of like stepping in with a different voice to kind of remind you of what's going on outside the hotel, and you know, playing a different game, almost with a little bit more of a critical edge to it.
I think the balance of play and almost analysis or history was very clean. It was great to read that because of course it's a heavy time period, but the playful elements and the hotel itself really sort of give the reader enough insulation to allow you to sort of enter that world without reservations, which is cool.
One of the questioners, whose name I am trying to make out, Mr. Damnoen Swartley, says the Count is an expert in wines. Are you an expert in wines?
You know, that is the thing I know. The only thing, the only thing I really know about wine is that I like to drink it. I mean, that's pretty much, that's the extent of my mastery of wine. And you know, and I am a cook, and so I do most of the cooking in the book are dishes that I make for my family. And that, you know, so that's you know, where I come in with a lot of knowledge. The wine is a place where I'm stealing knowledge or faking it. You know. But yeah, the food I know better. And actually, as an aside, for those of you, because the season's getting very good for this, one of the dishes, for instance, in the book that I've made for my family for a long, long time is, it takes place in the Advent chapter, which is right around Christmas time, early in the book. And the Count is kind of in the piazza, and he's observing a young couple who are on their first date. And he's worried that the boy is going to blow it by ordering something too expensive or too cheap. Either one would be a disaster, ruin the date, you know, different ways. And the kid says, I'll have the Latvian stew. And the Count's like, oh, well done, lad, a perfect choice, you know. And the girl gets the Latvian stew, and the Count orders it too. Well, you know, I make the Latvian stew. And if you Google Amor Towles Latvian stew, it will take you to a website where there's an essay by me and the recipe.
Wonderful.
It is a very sweet fall and winter dish. And so, yeah, it's time to gear that up and, go find that. It's worth cooking.
We'll try it.
Yeah. But I say, so I have more knowledge about the food than I have about the wine.
That's amazing. I think author recipes are a thing. I supplied a borscht to a cookbook one time. If anyone wants more Russian dishes. Here's a good one from an email address, kmjackson@middlebury.edu. Do you think it is helpful to read a book about confinement when we're living through a confinement or not?
That's a question I would like to ask the readers, right? I mean, that isn't a question for me, but I do. One of the great things about the modern era as an author is if you go to amortowles.com and you go to the contact page and you put up a question, it goes right to me. It's not going to a staff. I don't have a staff. It goes to me. It doesn't go to the publisher. And so people they have a chance to submit to me, their feedback on the book or things that strike them. And by the way, if we don't reach your question tonight, feel free to go to amortowles.com, the contact page, and I'll answer your question if we miss it tonight. But one of the interesting things that I want to frame this a little bit. I do not set out. I've never set out to write timely fiction. And there are some people, particularly let's say on the nonfiction side, who write timely books for a living. That's the whole point. They're trying to talk about what's going on in the White House or what's going on in the changes in gender in America, and that's their topic, and they're going for it. There are novelists who do that too, to some degree, who might take something which is really hot on the surface of the American table, and that's what they're going to build into their story. That gives me anxiety. Like I don't try to write timely appointed books. I am much more interested in writing a work that would be somehow timeless. That's really my greater artistic ambition. So one of the things I loved about Agenda Moscow when I went to pitch it, my publishing house had already said after Rule Civility, we'll buy your next book, sight unseen. I said, great. So we signed the contract. I mean, the ink was wet, and they said, so what's it going to be? And I'm like, it's going to be about a Russian aristocrat who gets sentenced to house arrest for 30 years, and you're never going to leave the hotel. And they're like, what? They're like, what?
Rip up the contract.
Yeah, they're like, what? Yeah. So, but they were great. They got behind. I joke about it because what I love about that premise is that it's so not timely. There's nothing about it that was timely, and it's an invitation to me to go and take this thing and try to build a world which is true to itself, as I said, that has poetic resonance of some kind, that can reverberate thematically and through imagery and through sentiments and through the correct characters in a way that readers can come to it from different directions at different times and hopefully find something for them, some both entertainment and some stimulation of their thoughts and feelings. That's really for me what I'm going after. And so it was very interesting, having said that, for the book to suddenly find its timeliness in this weird way. I mean, I wouldn't wish COVID on anybody, any country, any century, anything. But it was interesting to see as people began to reach out specifically to say, I had read the book before and I've gone back and reading it again in this time because, the count is giving me a different way to think about the fact that I have not left my home, particularly older people who literally aren't leaving the home, haven't seen their family, or the groceries are being brought to them, because they may have a condition which would make them more exposed. And so to see, and of course it's very moving to receive that kind of feedback. And I'm glad that the book can help bring people some small satisfaction, during a time like that. And the good news about it is most of people, if the book drove them crazy, they don't send you the email, so it kind of, mostly you hear the good news.
Mark Gerath, or Gareth, don't know, says that the relationship between Rostov and Sophia is so strong and well told. I was surprised that he didn't follow her to the West. I wonder how you decided to make that decision. Is it a statement that his love for Russia is stronger than his relationship with Sophie?
First off, for all of those who haven't finished the book, I'm sorry. we're digging into the back half of the book here. And if you haven't finished, it's really your own fault.
Everyone's finished.
You were
Everyone's
supposed to be. You were supposed to be done by now.
Finish your
Yeah.
book.
But so yes, there is a character in the book who leaves Russia and who has an emotional tie to the Count. And I have received, some people will reach out to me and say, how could you do that? How could you allow this character to be separated from that character? This critical moment. And the reality is that that's the way it goes. If you go and you look at what happened in Vienna or Berlin, as the Nazis gained ground, in many cases, Jewish families who could afford to sent their children out of the country in many cases, and they stayed behind. The parents stayed behind. That happened in London during the Blitzkrieg. You would send your kids into the countryside with their aunts and uncles, and the parents very often stayed in London. You saw it in the potato famine, where people, immigrants would send their teenage son to America. And if the teenage son earned enough money in America that you could bring another person across, they sent across the sister, and the parents stayed at home during the famine. And that's very common in history, right? And it's true for a variety of reasons. I think, that the questioner has suggested to both of them in a way, which is that the older person to some degree feels like this is where I am. I'm 50 years old, 60 years old, whatever my age. This is where I was raised. It's where I work. It's where I fell in love with my wife. It's where my colleagues are. It's where my patriotism is based. Even in this terrible time, and so it's hard for that person to sort of say, well, I'm going to go move because it would be more convenient or safer or whatever. But on the other hand, for the children, they may think about that very differently. They may feel like, wait, just because this is my background, my patriotism, it doesn't mean that I have to force that on my child. And in fact, on the contrary, I want my child to have the greatest possible, freedoms and safety and opportunities for joy and advancement possible. So I am prepared to separate myself from that child in order to deal with this paradox, these contradictory feelings. And so yes, I think that that's kind of where that comes from in the thematics of the book.
I mean, the symmetry was powerful. He came back to Russia to save his sister, who he couldn't save, and then at the end of the book, he sends his daughter outside of Russia to save her, and he succeeds in saving her, but also loses her as he lost his sister. So I thought it had a balance, I think, which was cool. I had a writing question. This is a good one from CJANKE. CJanke? I'm not sure. What part of the novel gave you the most trouble and why?
Wow, that's a tough question. Well, I think this is probably the biggest answer in a way, is that when I started the book, I knew that my biggest risk was getting readers through the first 100 pages, or 100 or so, because the nature of the book is, I like to think of it as a diamond on its side. And what I mean by that is that it starts with a point, which is the Count goes through the door of the hotel and he's sentenced to house arrest. And in the course of the first half of the book, it's like a diamond opening out like that, which is that you learn the hotel, you meet the people in the hotel, you learn his past, you're introduced to objects that play a critical role, historical references, cultural references, they're all being thrown at you in this sort of opening. And I knew that there was a good chance that many readers would say, what the hell is this all about? Where is this going, But I knew if I could get them kind of to the midpoint, the thing was going to go like this, where it's all going to come back together, and all these components that have been introduced would play this accelerating role in the resolution of events and sentiments and themes. And so if I could get them to page 120, I knew that the book was going to carry them all the way to the end. But so going back to the question, that first 120 pages started out as 220 pages, and I just kept working them to make them sharper and faster, and to try to get you to that critical turning point in the book faster. And it requires a lot of economy. It also requires, and some of you may have been like, I quit after 50 pages, so I don't know what the hell he's talking about. But for those of you who stayed, part of it is I knew that I had to have the sentences be interesting enough to be like, okay, yeah, nothing's happening right here, but I like the way that was put. I'll buy another page. He's bought another page off of me. But it had to have this internal charm within the writing itself that would, even though things weren't happening, even though all these elements were being used, that you would continue to go on for a little bit longer to see where this whole thing was going to take you. And that was the greatest challenge.
Oh, I have a quick follow-up question because I'm really curious. Was the turning point for you Sophia's arrival, or was it his suicide attempts? I feel like those two both were like big switches in attitude and tone.
There's a couple. I think that clearly the suicide attempt, which kind of closes in a way that the section that I was just describing. I have to get you to that. Is because the next page, it's 4 years later, maybe, or maybe even 8 years later, and he's a waiter. It's 4 years later, and he's the waiter. Yeah. And so that to me is the first thing. In many ways, the book is a novel of purpose, and the Count kind of enters the novel enters the hotel with one vision of what purpose might mean, but it's a pretty immature version of purpose. He's never, and over the course of the novel, he's going to discover deeper senses of what purpose can mean, and kind of round one of that is, the first critical one is in essence getting a job, and finding a sense of purpose through his relationships in the kitchen, and through the perfection of a task, and a task which is in the service of others, and so then you kind of later on you go through another round, right, which is that purpose is apparent, and so I think those are both both are big ones, but one kind of on sort of in this longer term progression in his life.
I think we have time for one more question. Catherine, do you have one ready?
I mean, no, please go ahead. I do. Meditating on plot.
A couple of people have raised questions about the 18-hour miniseries for television.
Yep.
I'm wondering what role you have in that, and whether you're satisfied with the choice of Kenneth Branagh as the lead.
Yep. So I am involved in that. I mean, the team has been that series, and it's evolved, and it has evolved over time. It is probably going to be more like an 8-hour series, which is probably more consistent with what it should be, which is great. I think that's an improvement over stretching it out over too long a time. And from the beginning, I did not want it to be a feature film, because I didn't think a 2-hour film, although we had offers on that front, I didn't think 2 hours would do the story justice. So some version of 6 or 8 hours would allow you to kind of move through time like the book, like the Count and the book do, and like Russia does. And so I think that's a good realization. I am not writing it. I have done some creative work for the team. As we rethink what it's going to look like in an 8-hour format. And Branagh, I think he's great. He's a great actor. And part of the challenge of the book for Hollywood, as it were, is that the Count is 30 at the beginning of the book. He's 60 at the end of the book. And so you can hire a 30-year-old and put makeup on him, or you can hire a 60-year-old and put soft light on him at the beginning, but you got to do something, And so, and I love, I think that Branagh has a great range in terms of, he can play comedy, he can play sentiment, he can play very serious work, and of course comes across. He can do the aristocratic charm, I think, very well.
Usually, yeah.
So I like it. Now that was a pretty quick question. So I'd like to tell one story before I go.
Sure.
Even though that was the last question, because this kind of brings up together a sort of variety of things. It's a little bit of a window on the creative process for me, and it's sort of and the kismet of the creative effort. So you have to go back to when I was a kid. My family, I grew up in Boston, and we would summer on Martha's Vineyard Island. And when I was about 8 years old, at the end of the summer, one summer, I put a note in the bottle and threw it in the ocean. And weeks went by, and I think the note said, to whoever finds this, I hope it made it to China. I was 8 years old, right? That's my first sentence. So threw it in the ocean. A couple of weeks go by, we go home, and it was, we had nobody had been in the house for a couple of weeks, and so the mail's all piled up, and my mother's going through this big pile of mail, and she suddenly says, "There's a letter here for Amor." It's like this big. It's a little envelope, and with my name, it says Master Amor Towles typed out on the envelope, and she says, "It's from the New York Times." And it's true, the logo of the New York Times in the upper left-hand corner of the envelope. And I'm like, yeah, that's my letter. Give it to me. So it turns out that the guy who found the note in the bottle was one of the managing editors of the New York Times. It was a guy named Harrison Salisbury. And Salisbury was one of the great 20th century journalists generally. And, he was the Times man in Hanoi. He was a great World War II correspondent. When he eventually came back to the Home Office, he was the person who was given the task of launching the op-ed page for the New York Times when they first introduced that page, and he oversaw that. So he was a great statesman journalist. And so he wrote me back, and he says, "Dear Master Towles, I'm afraid to say that your letter did not make it to China. Made it down the beach, but I found it." And so we ended up having a correspondence, from the time I was 8 until I was 18, when for the first time in my life I went to New York City and I met him. And he was, and at that point I was one of the editors of my school paper, and it was a great thrill to meet him and to sort of have his sort of chip into my life on occasion by correspondence as I made the trip from 8 to 18. Well, so I told you earlier that having written the first draft, I then went and stayed in the Metropolitan Hotel, which is true. What I didn't tell you is that one of the interesting things about the Metropolitan is that because it was one of the only good hotels in Russia in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, any famous person who went to Russia during that era tended to either have drank at the Metropole, slept at the Metropole, or ate at the Metropole. So at some point they went in the Metropole. And so if you start looking through the memoirs of Americans who went to Russia, at any point between 1920 and 1950, you can tend to find references to the Metropole. So I did that. I went out and I found, 40 or 50 of them. E. Cummings talks about it, his time in the Metropole in his memoirs. John Steinbeck talks about his time at the Metropole while he was in Russia. Lillian Hellman, the great American playwright, who was also Dashiell Hammett's lover, writes about the Metropole Hotel. And now, in addition, all the American journalists wrote about, and British journalists wrote about the Metropole because that was the watering hole. The bar at the Metropole is where all the British and American journalists hung out from the time of the Revolution through the Second World War and the Cold War. And so, I was at the bar Metropolitan last night with so-and-so, and so-and-so walked in, and that was always a part of their storytelling. So what I did is, as I was finishing the first draft, I gathered together as many firsthand accounts of events at the Metropole as I could find, and Xeroxed them, and without reading them, carried them with me to Russia. Now, just before I was leaving, I was scanning through one of these journalists as I was Xeroxing the pages of a memoir of a journalist who had spent, say the 50s in Moscow. And suddenly he says, and that was the night that, I hopped in the cabin with Salisbury and we shot over to the Kremlin. And I was like, oh my God, I completely forgotten that Harrison Salisbury was the New York Times bureau chief in Moscow from the end of the Second World War into the Cold War. And I was like, well, he must have written about it. So, you go through the internet, I'm looking through old used bookstores and stuff. And sure enough, he wrote a memoir about his time in Moscow. So I send for it and it comes and I put, I've got this whole stack of Xeroxes and I got Salisbury's memoir and I go to fly to Russia. And, first of all, I'm like, man, I hope that hotel is everything I think it is, because I just spent a year and a half writing a book about it, But so I get to the hotel and, I say, I'm an American author. I write a book about the hotel and they gave me a nice suite and everything. And so there I could see I'm basically in the Count's suite 317. You can see the Bolshoi out my window. And I start to go through the materials that I had brought with me as I'm beginning the process of revision. And I start with Salisbury's memoir. Page 1, it says, I landed at the Russian airport, hopped in the cab and said, take me to the Metropole. And I was like, you got to be kidding. And it turns out he lived at the Metropole the entire first couple of years that he was in Moscow. So he talks about it all the time. And all kinds of things happened to him in the Metropole. And so I started taking little elements from his memoirs and weaving them into the book. There's a moment where in the book where there's a line of women outside of a church, which is now providing milk. Andre's wife goes there. And there's other places where there was shorter lines. And so the question is, why do these women line up to go to this particular place where you get milk, at this old decommissioned church? And the reason is because there was a mosaic in the back of the church that had never been dismantled. And the women would save your place in line, which they didn't generally do, if you wanted to go and pray. And you could then come back and take your place in line. And this was kind of a secret sort of thing of these women who would go to this old decommissioned church to buy their milk. It was really a place to pray. That was in Harrison's memoir. He stumbles on this. And he figures it out over the course of trying to figure out, why is there this big line here? And so, that's there. He's in the hotel, actually, the day Stalin dies. And they close the hotel. Meaning they won't let anybody out of the hotel because they close the city of Moscow. The powers that be, there's a possibility of a coup, basically.
Right.
And they close the city of Moscow, and they've, certain military forces are on alert. There's literally military, there's tanks coming down certain roads. But they won't let the journalists out of the hotel. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. And what ends up happening is that they go to the Mexican attaché suite, where you can look out across Theater Square, and suddenly there's this big line of limos showing up at the building across the street from the Metropolitan, across the plaza from the Metropolitan. It's the old palace of the nobles. And it's because they had brought Stalin's body, and the Politburo got to go pay the first visit to go see his dead body before they made the news public, partly to make sure that it was true. Everybody wanted to see it from their own eyes and to see it all at the same time, to sort of maintain some kind of sense of political stability and transition. And so all the journalists are packed into the Mexican attaché's corner suite, looking at the limousines, beginning to figure out what has just happened. And so I weave that into the story, when Stalin dies. And I was doing that. Suddenly I was like, but I wasn't mentioning Salisbury. I was like, what am I thinking? He should be in the book. Forget taking his things. What about him? So that's what happens when Stalin dies. It actually says, it refers to Salisbury and the other journalists going through the thing. And at the end of the book, I knew that the Count needed a disguise at a certain point, and that he was going to need a critical in the last page of the book. And I was like, you know what? It's going to be Salisbury's trench coat and fedora. And that's what he does, is he goes to the coat room of the restaurant when Salisbury's eating, and he steals his hat and coat. And that's what he uses, at this critical moment in the final pages. And that was, for me, a way of sort of giving back a little gift to this man who had died some years ago, but who had been so kind to me as a young correspondent.
Nice.
There you go.
It's a great story
to end on.
Thanks. True story.
Thank you so much. That was a great way to
end. Michael, thank you both. It's really rare to be interviewed by people who know so much more about Russia than I do. So I really appreciate that. And with literary sensibilities to boot. And I want to thank Williams, the alumni team, for inviting me to do this. But most of all, thanks to all of you alumni for taking the time to read the book, to think about it, and to join us here tonight. Thank you.
It was such a huge pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and being with us tonight. It was fantastic.
This is the end of the webinar, and it's been a fabulous conversation. And we'd like to offer our special thanks and appreciation to you for volunteering to be with us. Special thanks to Catherine, my former student, to Kelly Lamb for organizing the event, also to Danielle Madison from Media Services for making everything run smoothly. And finally, thank you all for joining us, the members of the MiddReads Book Club, and for your enthusiasm and engagement this evening. Next up, MiddReads will be reading Afterlife, the latest novel by Middlebury alumna and writer-in-residence emerita, Julia Alvarez, class of 1971. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.